Elaine Whitaker had always believed that after 22 years of marriage, she understood the difference between worry and wisdom. Her life had settled into something steady, something predictable in the best possible way. Mornings began with a quiet hum of coffee brewing. Evenings ended with soft conversations in the living room, and in between, there was a rhythm she had come to trust. Mark had always been part of that rhythm. Calm, observant, never the kind of man who raised his voice or made something out of nothing. That was why, when he first mentioned Jason, she didn't take it seriously. The job at Hensley & Crow Marketing had come at a time when Elaine wasn't necessarily looking for change, but welcomed it anyway. After years of part-time consulting and freelance work, stepping into a structured office environment again felt both exciting and unfamiliar. The building itself carried an energy she hadn't felt in years. Fast-moving conversations, sharp-dressed professionals, the low buzz of ambition hanging in the air. Jason Mercer had been one of the first people to greet her. He was the kind of person who made things easier without trying too hard. Confident but not intimidating. Friendly but not overbearing. On her first day, when everything felt slightly overwhelming, he had been the one who walked her through the internal systems, explained the small office habits no one formally taught, and even showed her where the decent coffee was hidden behind a cabinet no one bothered labeling. "First week's always chaos," he had said with an easy smile. "After that, it's just organized chaos." Elaine had laughed, grateful for the simplicity of it. There was nothing remarkable about the interaction at the time, just a coworker being kind. At home that evening, she mentioned him casually while setting the table. "There's this guy, Jason," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Helped me get through the day without feeling completely lost." Mark looked up briefly from where he was drying a glass, nodding once. "That's good. Makes a difference when someone takes the time." It ended there, or at least it should have. Over the next few weeks, Jason's presence became part of her daily routine. They worked on a few projects together, exchanged ideas during meetings, occasionally shared a quick lunch when schedules overlapped. He had a way of making even tedious tasks feel lighter, filling silences with easy conversation that never seemed forced. Elaine didn't notice how often she mentioned him at first. Slipped into conversations naturally. "Jason thinks the client might push back on the proposal. Jason showed me a shortcut for the reporting system. Jason said the director might be restructuring the team soon." Each time, Mark listened the same way he always did. Quietly, attentively, without interruption. But there was something different in his silence. Not sharp, not suspicious, just thoughtful. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the television playing softly in the background, he spoke in a tone so calm it almost blended into the room. "You've been mentioning him a lot." Elaine glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's just work stuff. We're on the same projects most of the time." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes still on the screen. "I figured. Just pay attention to that." There was no accusation in his voice, no tension, just a quiet observation. Elaine felt a flicker of confusion, quickly brushed aside. "You think I don't know how to handle a coworker?" "I think you do," he said. "I just also think sometimes things don't stay what they start as." She exhaled lightly, shaking her head. "Mark, it's nothing like that. He's just being helpful." "I didn't say it was anything," he replied just as gently. The conversation drifted away, dissolving into the background like it had never happened. But something about it lingered, even if she didn't want to admit it. At work, nothing seemed different. Jason was still the same, approachable, engaging, occasionally teasing in a way that felt harmless. He had started stopping by her desk more often, leaning casually against the edge as they discussed projects or exchanged small talk about things outside of work. "Still surviving the chaos?" he asked one afternoon, a grin playing at the corner of his mouth. "Barely," she replied, smiling back. "I think I'm starting to understand how things actually run around here." "Careful," he said lightly. "That's when they start giving you more responsibility." She laughed, the sound coming easily. There was comfort in the familiarity of it. After years of a quieter professional life, being part of something dynamic again felt good. Being noticed felt good. Being included in conversations, in decisions. It all carried a subtle sense of validation she hadn't realized she missed. When Jason first texted her outside of work, it didn't seem unusual. It was about a presentation. "Hey, quick question about tomorrow's slides. Did you end up adjusting the final section?" Elaine responded without hesitation, treating it as an extension of the workday. But then came another message later that evening. "By the way, you handled that meeting really well today." She paused for a moment before replying with a simple thanks. It wasn't inappropriate. Not exactly. Just unnecessary. Over the next few days, the messages continued. Sometimes about work. Sometimes not. A comment about a difficult client. A joke about something that happened in the office. A quick, "Hope your day's going better than mine." Elaine didn't think much of it. She responded when it felt natural, ignored it when she was busy. To her, it was still within the boundaries of normal. At least, that's what she told herself. Mark noticed the shift before she did. Not in anything obvious. She wasn't hiding her phone. She wasn't acting secretive. But there was a subtle change in her attention, in the way she occasionally smiled at something on her screen, in the slight pause before she responded to messages even during dinner. One night, as she set her phone face down on the table, he spoke again, just as calmly as before. "Is he texting you now?" Elaine looked up, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her expression. "Yeah, about work." Mark nodded, though his gaze lingered a second longer than usual. "Outside of work hours." "It's not a big deal," she said quickly. "We have deadlines. Sometimes things come up." "I understand that," he replied. "Just be careful how much of your time you give away." There it was again. Not anger, not suspicion, just quiet caution. Elaine felt a slight tightening in her chest, though she couldn't quite explain why. "You're overthinking it," she said, softer this time. "Maybe," Mark admitted. "Or maybe I'm just noticing things you don't have to." She let out a small breath, turning her attention back to her plate. "There's nothing to notice." Mark didn't respond, and that, more than anything, should have made her stop and think. Instead, she let the silence settle, convincing herself that everything was exactly as it seemed. 'Cause it was easier that way. In the weeks that followed, the lines between professional and personal began to blur in ways Elaine didn't immediately recognize. Nothing about Jason's behavior seemed abrupt or inappropriate at first glance. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable, like a shift in temperature you only feel once it's already changed. He started waiting for her after meetings, walking beside her back to their desks even when his own was in the opposite direction. Conversations that once revolved around deadlines and campaigns slowly drifted into lighter, more personal territory. "What do you usually do on weekends?" he asked one afternoon, spinning a pen between his fingers as he leaned casually against her desk. "Nothing too exciting," Elaine replied, keeping her tone easy. "Mark and I usually keep things simple. Dinner, maybe a movie. Sometimes we visit friends." Jason nodded, though something in his expression lingered a moment too long. "Sounds stable." The word hung there, carrying a tone she couldn't quite place. Not judgmental. Not exactly admiration either. Just something undefined. "It is," she said, a little more firmly than she intended. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's rare." At the time, she dismissed it as just another passing comment. People spoke differently, thought differently. It didn't mean anything. But the conversations didn't stop there. Jason began sharing more about his own life. Stories about past relationships that hadn't worked out, vague hints about being misunderstood, about wanting something real but never quite finding it. There was always a certain carefulness in the way he spoke, as if revealing just enough to invite curiosity, but never enough to fully explain himself. Elaine listened, sometimes offering polite responses, sometimes just nodding along. Felt harmless, human even. People talked, people connected. That didn't mean boundaries were being crossed. At least, not in a way she could clearly see. The messages outside of work became more frequent. Less about projects, more about moments. Long day. You surviving? Just past that coffee place you mentioned. You were right, it's terrible. Random question. Do you ever feel like you ended up somewhere you didn't plan? Elaine would read them, sometimes smiling, sometimes hesitating before replying. There was a growing awareness she didn't want to name, a quiet sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. Home Mark remained the same. Steady, present, unchanged. And yet, there was a difference in the way he watched her now. Not constantly, not suspiciously, but attentively, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. One evening, as they cleared the dinner table together, he spoke again. You've been distracted lately. Elaine paused, placing a plate into the sink. Work's just been busy. Mark nodded, drying his hands slowly. Busy isn't the same as distracted. She turned to face him, a faint edge in her voice. What are you trying to say? I'm not trying to say anything, he replied calmly. I'm just noticing a change. There is no change, she said, quicker this time. I started a new job, of course things feel different. Mark studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable but not unkind. All right, that was it. No argument, no pushback. But something about the simplicity of his response unsettled her more than if he had pressed the issue. The next day at work, Elaine found herself paying closer attention, though she couldn't quite explain why. Jason greeted her the same way he always did. Easy smile, casual tone. But there was something more deliberate in his interactions now. He stood a little closer, held eye contact a second longer, found reasons to linger in conversations that could have ended sooner. During lunch, he slid into the seat across from her without asking, setting his tray down with a relaxed confidence. You always sit here, he asked. Most days, she replied. Good, he said, almost absently. I was hoping I'd find you. The words were simple, but they carried a weight she couldn't ignore this time. She looked at him more carefully then, really looking in a way she hadn't before. There was nothing overtly inappropriate in his expression, nothing she could point to and say, this is where it changed. And yet, the feeling was there, subtle, persistent. You didn't have to go looking, she said lightly. I'm not hard to find. Jason smiled, leaning back in his chair. That's kind of the point. For the first time, Elaine didn't immediately respond. That evening, when her phone lit up again, she hesitated before picking it up. Missed our conversation today. You disappeared too quickly. She stared at the message longer than necessary, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something about it felt different now. Not wrong exactly, just too familiar. She typed a short response. Had work to finish. His reply came almost instantly. You always do. Elaine set the phone down without answering. When Mark walked into the room a few minutes later, he didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. His eyes flicked briefly toward the phone, then back to her face. You okay? He asked. She nodded. Yeah, just tired. He studied her for a second, then gave a small nod. Get some rest. There was no accusation in his voice, no tension, just the same quiet steadiness he had always carried. And for a moment, Elaine felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Uncertainty. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon, in a way she never would have expected. The office was quieter than usual, most of the team out for client meetings or working remotely. Elaine sat at her desk reviewing a report, the low hum of the air conditioning filling the space around her. She didn't notice Jason approach until he was already there. Got a minute? He asked, his tone different, less casual, more deliberate. She looked up, slightly surprised. Sure. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood beside her desk, his hands resting lightly against the edge as if grounding himself. There's something I've been meaning to say, he began. Elaine felt a small tightening in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. Okay. Jason exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on hers. "I think you know this isn't just work for me anymore." The words landed heavier than she expected. "I don't understand," she said, though a part of her already did. He gave a faint, almost nervous smile. "Come on, Elaine. The way we talk, the way we connect, you feel it too." For a brief moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. "No," she said firmly, the clarity in her voice surprising even herself. "I don't." Jason blinked, as if thrown off by the immediacy of her response. "I'm married," she continued, standing now, putting a subtle distance between them. "Happily married." "I know that," he said quickly. "I'm not saying you have to." "That's exactly what you're saying," she cut in, her tone calm but unyielding. "And you're wrong." Silence filled the space between them. For the first time since she had met him, Jason didn't seem confident. He looked uncertain, almost searching for something to recover the moment. "I thought," he started, then stopped. "You thought wrong," Elaine said, softer now, but no less firm. She picked up her folder, needing something to hold, something to anchor herself. "This has to stay professional. Nothing else." Jason nodded slowly, though the ease that once defined him was gone. "Yeah, of course." But the damage was already done. Not to her marriage, not in the way she had feared, but to the illusion she had been holding on to. Because in that moment, everything Mark had said, every quiet warning, every careful observation, came rushing back with a clarity she couldn't ignore anymore. And for the first time, she realized he hadn't been overreacting at all. Elaine drove home that evening in complete silence, the kind that pressed against her thoughts rather than calming them. The road stretched ahead of her in familiar lines, every turn and signal something she had followed hundreds of times before, yet nothing felt quite the same now. Jason's words replayed in her mind, not because they mattered anymore, but because of what they revealed. It hadn't been sudden. It hadn't been unpredictable. The signs had been there all along, layered in small moments she had chosen to overlook, softened by her own assumptions about what was harmless and what wasn't. And beneath all of that was something heavier, the quiet realization that Mark had seen it before she did. When she stepped inside the house, the familiar warmth of home greeted her, but even that felt different now. Mark was in the living room, sitting in his usual spot, a book resting open in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression steady, as if nothing in the world had shifted. "Hey," he said simply. Elaine closed the door behind her, her movements slower than usual. "Hey." For a moment she just stood there, unsure how to begin. The weight of everything she needed to say pressed against her, but the words didn't come easily. Not because she didn't know what happened, but because she finally understood what it meant. Mark set his book aside, giving her his full attention without saying anything more. He didn't rush her. He never did. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He nodded once. "Okay." She took a small breath, stepping further into the room. "You were right." The words hung in the air, heavier than any explanation that could have followed. Mark didn't react immediately. He didn't look surprised or satisfied or even concerned, just attentive. Elaine swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "Jason, he said something today. He thought there was something more between us." She watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of anger, but there was none. Just the same calm presence he had always carried. "And there wasn't," she added quickly. "I made that clear. I told him I'm married. That it's not going to happen." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing her words without interruption. "All right." That was all he said at first. Elaine felt a flicker of frustration rise, not at him, but at the simplicity of his response. "That's it?" she asked. "You're not going to say anything else?" He met her gaze, his voice even. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Something. Anything." Mark leaned back slightly, considering his words before speaking. "You handled it." "That's not the point," she said, shaking her head. "You tried to tell me. More than once. And I didn't listen. There was a pause, not uncomfortable but meaningful. I wasn't trying to prove a point, Mark said finally. I was just paying attention. Elaine let that sink in, the simplicity of it cutting deeper than she expected. How did you know? He exhaled softly, his gaze steady but thoughtful. I didn't know exactly what would happen. I just recognized the pattern. What pattern? The way things shift, he said. It's not about one big moment. It's small changes, frequency, familiarity, the way someone starts taking up space they didn't have before. Elaine felt her chest tighten slightly as his words mirrored everything she had only just begun to understand. You mentioned him more, Mark continued. Then he started showing up outside of work, even if it was just messages. Then your attention started shifting little by little. None of it seemed like a problem on its own. But together it was leading somewhere. And I didn't see it, she said quietly. He shook his head. You didn't have a reason to look for it. She looked down for a moment, her thoughts tangled between regret and clarity. You weren't jealous. No, Mark said. If I thought you were doing something wrong, I would have said that. But that wasn't it. Then what was it? He paused briefly before answering. It was about protecting something before it needed fixing. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. Elaine sank into the chair across from him, her mind replaying every conversation they'd had over the past few weeks. Every time he had spoken calmly, without accusation. Every time she had dismissed him, not because he was wrong, but because she believed she understood the situation better. I thought you were overreacting, she admitted. I know, he said without resentment. And you weren't. Mark offered a faint, almost tired smile. It's not about being right. It's about seeing clearly. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't empty. It carried understanding, the kind that didn't need to be filled with more words. Elaine looked at him, really looked at him, with a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. 4 years, she had trusted him without question. Not because he demanded it, but because he had always earned it in quiet, consistent ways. And yet, when it mattered most, she had hesitated to trust the one thing that came just as naturally to him. His perception. I should have listened, she said softly. Mark didn't rush to agree or disagree. He simply nodded once. Maybe. Or maybe you needed to see it yourself. She considered that, realizing there was truth in it. If he had pushed harder, if he had been more forceful, she might have resisted even more. But he hadn't. He had given her space to understand, even if it meant waiting for the outcome he already suspected. I won't ignore that again, she said. I'm not asking you to, he replied. Just don't assume concern means doubt. Sometimes it's the opposite. Elaine felt something shift inside her then, something subtle but lasting. A deeper understanding of what their marriage had always been built on. Not just trust but awareness. Not just love but the willingness to listen even when nothing seemed wrong. Because sometimes nothing looks wrong until it is. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as the weight of the day began to settle into something more manageable. It's strange, she said after a moment. Everything felt normal. That's what made it so easy to ignore. Mark nodded. That's usually how it works. They sat in silence for a while after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important had already been understood. Outside, the evening stretched on quietly, the same as it always did. But inside something had shifted, not broken, not damaged, but sharpened. A reminder that even in the most stable relationships, it's not just trust that keeps things strong. It's attention.